Some men defend themselves with words. Darnell never did. He let his work speak, let his loyalty speak, let his silence carry the weight of every insult he swallowed at that table. But when the phone rang that evening, the truth no longer needed his permission to be heard. The alarm hadn't gone off yet, but Darnell was already awake. 5:47 in the morning, and his eyes were open, staring at the ceiling the same way they had been for the last 11 years. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of early morning traffic beginning to stir outside their window. Beside him, Simone slept with her back turned, the space between them wider than the mattress could measure. Her breathing was steady, undisturbed, peaceful in a way that their marriage hadn't been in years. Darnell couldn't remember the last time she'd faced him in the night. Couldn't remember the last time she'd reached for him without needing something. Couldn't remember the last time she'd looked at him like he was the man she'd fallen in love with, rather than a disappointment she was forced to tolerate. But Darnell wasn't the kind of man who kept score. He was the kind who kept going, the kind who woke up before the sun and faced the day, regardless of what the day had taken from him the day before. That's who his mother had raised him to be, and that's who he remained, even when staying that man cost him more than anyone would ever know. He rose quietly, his feet finding the cold floor without complaint. The house was modest, 3 bedrooms in a neighborhood that tried hard, but never quite arrived. The kind of neighborhood where people mowed their lawns on Saturdays and waved at each other from driveways, but nobody really knew anybody's business. Darnell had bought the house 12 years ago, back when he thought it would be a starting point. Back when Simone had stood in the empty living room with her hand in his and called it their starter home, her eyes bright with the future she imagined they would build together. But somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing this house as a beginning and started seeing it as proof that they'd never move forward, that he'd never move them forward. The walls that once felt like promise now felt like prison, at least to her. Darnell still loved the house. He loved what it represented. Honest work, steady progress, a roof that belonged to him because he'd earned it. But his love for the house had become another thing Simone held against him, another sign that his ambitions were too small, that he was too small. Darnell moved through his morning routine the way he moved through most things, with quiet precision and careful intention. He ironed his own shirts because Simone had stopped offering years ago. There was a time, early in their marriage, when she would wake up with him, press his clothes while he showered, have coffee waiting when he came downstairs. But those days had faded so gradually that Darnell couldn't pinpoint when they ended. It was like watching a photograph yellow with age. You don't notice it happening until one day you look and realize the colors you remember are gone. He made his coffee in silence because conversation had become a luxury they couldn't afford. Not because they didn't have time, but because they didn't have words, at least not kind ones. Everything Darnell said seemed to land wrong with Simone. Every plan he shared was met with skepticism. Every hope he expressed was countered with reality checks that felt more like attacks. So he learned to keep his coffee quiet and his thoughts quieter. It was easier that way. Safer. He checked his work bag twice before leaving, not because he was forgetful, but because details mattered to him. They always had. His mother used to say that a man's character showed in the small things, the way he kept his word, the way he treated people who couldn't do anything for him, the way he handled the moments nobody was watching. Darnell believed that. He believed the small things were the only things that held the big things together. And so he checked his bag twice, confirmed his keys were in his pocket, and left the house before the sun had fully claimed the sky. Simone hadn't stirred. She wouldn't notice he was gone until she needed something from him, and by then, he'd already be deep into a day that required more of him than she ever thought to ask for. The drive to work took 37 minutes on a good day, 45 when traffic conspired against him. Darnell didn't mind the commute. It gave him time to think, time to prepare, time to exist in the space between the man he was at home and the man he was everywhere else. At home, he was the husband who never quite measured up. At work, he was something different, something more. Darnell worked as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm called Henderson and Associates. The building was unremarkable from the outside, 6 stories of glass and concrete in a business district that had seen better decades. But inside, Darnell had found something close to purpose. He'd been with the firm for 14 years, longer than most of his colleagues, longer than some of the partners. He wasn't in management, though he'd been offered promotions twice. Both times he declined, telling his supervisor he was comfortable where he was. His supervisor, a white man named Gerald, who had learned over the years to respect Darnell's quiet excellence, didn't push. He just nodded and said the door was always open. What Darnell didn't tell Gerald, what he didn't tell anyone at work, was that he needed his evenings free, needed his weekends, needed the hours that nobody asked about, because those hours belonged to something else entirely, something he'd been building in secret for 7 years, in a small workshop behind a storage unit across town. A dream so fragile and so precious that he'd never spoken it aloud to anyone except Winston. Not to his wife, not to his colleagues, not to anyone who might have crushed it before it had a chance to grow. At the office, Darnell was respected in the way that quiet competence earns respect. He wasn't the loudest voice in meetings, wasn't the one who took credit or sought spotlight, but he was the one people came to when the math didn't work, when the structure looked right on paper but felt wrong in practice, when the younger engineers got stuck on problems they couldn't solve and needed someone who could see what they couldn't. There was a young brother named Jalen who'd started at the firm 8 months ago, fresh out of Howard University with a degree in civil engineering and a nervousness that reminded Darnell of himself 20 years prior. Jalen was smart. That was obvious from day one. But smart wasn't enough in this field. You needed instinct. You needed the ability to feel when something was off even before the numbers told you so. And that kind of knowledge couldn't be taught in classrooms. It had to be passed down. Darnell had taken Jalen under his wing without being asked. He stayed late with the young man 3 nights a week, going over calculations and reviewing designs, teaching him the things no textbook could explain. How to read a client, how to anticipate problems before they became expensive mistakes, how to carry yourself in rooms full of people who expected you to fail because of the color of your skin. Jalen soaked it all up like a sponge, grateful in ways he expressed clumsily, but sincerely. One evening, after a particularly long session reviewing load-bearing specifications, Jalen looked at Darnell and asked the question that had clearly been on his mind for weeks. "Mr. Darnell, why do you do this? Stay late with me, I mean. You don't have to. It's not like they're paying you extra." Darnell leaned back in his chair and considered the question. Outside the window, the city lights were beginning to flicker on, and the office had grown quiet as their colleagues filtered home to their families and their dinners and their evenings. "Somebody did it for me once," Darnell said finally. "Old engineer named Roosevelt. Took time out of his days to teach me things I couldn't learn anywhere else. Never asked for anything in return. Never made me feel like I owed him." He paused, meeting Jalen's eyes. "That's how it works. You receive, and then one day, you give. The chain keeps going." Jalen nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "I hope I can do the same someday. Pass it on, I mean." "You will," Darnell said. "Just remember who you are when you get to wherever you're going. That's the hard part. Success has a way of making people forget." Jalen didn't fully understand what Darnell meant by that. He was too young, too new, too unscathed by the kind of disappointments that teach a man the true weight of his own integrity. But one day he would understand. One day, life would test him the way it had tested Darnell. And when that day came, Darnell hoped these conversations would echo in Jalen's memory and help him choose correctly. What Jalen didn't know, what Gerald didn't know, what nobody at Henderson and Associates knew, was that Darnell's real work happened after dark. In a workshop he rented behind a storage facility on the east side of town, surrounded by blueprints and prototypes and patent filings, and dreams too big to share with people who had stopped believing in him, Darnell had spent 7 years building something extraordinary. 2 technologies, both patented, both revolutionary in the field of structural load distribution, the kind of innovation that made sustainable construction not just possible, but profitable. The kind of breakthrough that large firms spent millions trying to develop and rarely achieved. Darnell had done it alone, in stolen hours, with resources scraped together from every corner of his life that Simone didn't monitor. He'd funded the work himself. Every dollar that Simone thought was sitting in their savings account. Every bonus she never asked about, because she assumed there was nothing worth asking. Every side consultation fee he collected for weekend work and deposited into an account she didn't know existed. All of it poured into this dream, year after year, until the dream became real. He'd filed the patents under his mother's maiden name, not because he was hiding from the law, but because he was hiding from the people who would have told him it was foolish, the people who would have laughed at his ambition, the people who sat across from him at Thanksgiving and reminded him, year after year, that he wasn't enough and would never be enough. Simone would have seen the patents as further proof of his failure to focus on their life together. Lorraine would have found a way to diminish them. Terrence would have offered unsolicited advice and subtle mockery dressed up as help. So Darnell built in silence. He protected his work the way a father protects a child, fiercely, completely, without apology. And 18 months ago, that protection had paid off in a way Darnell never expected. A man named Solomon Adeyemi, a 67-year-old Nigerian-American billionaire who had built an infrastructure empire from nothing, discovered Darnell's patents through an obscure industry journal. Solomon's team reached out. Then Solomon himself reached out. And for 18 months, they had been in conversation, negotiating an acquisition that would change Darnell's life forever. $22 million. That was the number on the table. $22 million for full rights to both technologies. It was the kind of money that Darnell had never allowed himself to imagine, not because he didn't believe in his work, but because hope had always felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. In his experience, hope was something that got taken away. Dreams were things that got crushed. Better to keep your head down, do the work, and let the results speak when they were ready. Well, the results were almost ready to speak. Darnell had met Simone 13 years ago at a friend's birthday party in a rooftop bar neither of them could afford. She had been different then. Warm, open, quick to laugh and quicker to touch his arm when he said something that made her smile. She worked in pharmaceutical sales, ambitious and driven, and Darnell had been drawn to her energy like a moth to flame. She talked about the future like it was a place they were already headed, and her certainty made him believe that maybe, for once, good things could last. He proposed 2 years later on a beach in South Carolina, the same beach where his mother had taken him as a child. Simone cried and said yes before he finished asking, and for a moment, Darnell allowed himself to believe that the life he'd always wanted was finally within reach. But marriage has a way of revealing what dating conceals. And what Simone concealed, from Darnell and perhaps from herself, was a hunger that his steadiness could never satisfy. She wanted more. More house. More car. More vacations. More proof that she had made the right choice in choosing him. And when the years passed, and the more didn't come fast enough, she stopped seeing Darnell as her partner and started seeing him as her obstacle, the thing standing between her and the life she deserved. The anchor dragging her down while her sister soared. The comments started small. A sigh when he suggested they wait another year before renovating the kitchen. A raised eyebrow when her coworker's husband bought his wife a new BMW. A laugh that wasn't quite a laugh when her mother made jokes about Darnell's little job and his modest ambitions. He absorbed it all without retaliation, not because he didn't feel it, but because he believed in the vows he'd taken. For better or for worse. He just hadn't realized that worse would come from inside his own home. Simone's mother was a woman named Lorraine, and Lorraine had never approved of Darnell. Not when they were dating, not when they got engaged, not when they married, and certainly not in the 11 years since. She was 64 years old, widowed for a decade, and she wore her opinions like expensive jewelry, loud, visible, and impossible to ignore. She had raised 2 daughters, and she had very specific ideas about what kind of men those daughters should marry. Simone was the younger daughter. The older one was named Nia, and Nia had married exactly the kind of man Lorraine approved of. His name was Terrence, an investment banker with a 7-figure salary, a house in the suburbs with a 3-car garage, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Terrence was everything Lorraine believed a successful man should be. He bought Nia a new Range Rover last year. He took her to the Maldives twice. He spoke at dinner parties about deals and acquisitions, while everyone listened and nodded and pretended to understand. He was, in Lorraine's estimation, the gold standard against which all other sons-in-law should be measured. And by that standard, Darnell was found wanting. Always wanting. Perpetually, irredeemably wanting. Lorraine never missed an opportunity to remind him of his place. She visited their home frequently, always bearing gifts that felt more like insults when examined closely. A book on financial planning for men who wanted to do better. A coupon for a discount suit store, because you could use a new look, Darnell. An article she'd clipped from a magazine about men who finally got their act together in their 40s, the implication clear as day. She told stories about Terrence's latest successes while looking directly at Darnell, her meaning unmistakable even when her words stayed technically polite. She compared. She measured. She found him lacking every single time. And Simone, his wife, his partner, the woman who had promised to stand beside him for better or for worse, never said a word in his defense. She laughed along with her mother's jokes. She nodded at the comparisons. She added her own comments sometimes, subtle digs disguised as observations. Well, Darnell's not really the ambitious type. Some people are just comfortable where they are. Not everyone can be like Terrence. A man can survive enemies. That's straightforward. You know where you stand with an enemy. But when the people who vowed to love you join the chorus of those tearing you down, when your own wife laughs at your expense, and your mother-in-law makes sport of your failures at her dinner table, that silence cuts different. That silence leaves scars that don't show on the skin. The phone call came on a Wednesday evening, 6 days before the dinner that would change everything. Darnell was in his workshop, surrounded by the evidence of 7 years of secret labor, reviewing the latest communication from Solomon Adeyemi's legal team. The final terms had been drafted. The numbers had been confirmed. All that remained was the formal conversation, the handshake, metaphorical or otherwise, that would make $22 million his. His phone buzzed on the workbench. Winston's name glowed on the screen. Winston had been Darnell's best friend for 23 years, since their freshman year at Georgia Tech, when they were assigned as roommates, and discovered they were both engineering majors from single-mother households who had been taught that excellence was the only acceptable response to a world that expected them to fail. They had studied together, graduated together, and built their lives in parallel. Winston becoming an attorney, Darnell becoming an engineer, both of them becoming men their mothers would have been proud of. Winston was the only person on Earth who knew about the patents, the only person who knew about the workshop, the only person who knew that the quiet, unassuming engineer who let his wife's family mock him at holiday dinners was sitting on a fortune he'd built with his own hands. "It's done," Winston said when Darnell answered. His voice carried the weight of something momentous, something they had both been waiting years to hear. Adeyemi's team signed off on the final terms this afternoon. He wants to speak with you personally to close it out. Darnell closed his eyes. $22 million. 7 years of silent work in this workshop. 11 years of quiet endurance in that house. "When?" Darnell asked. "He wants to call you Thursday evening, around 7. Darnell's breath caught. Thursday. That was the dinner. Lorraine's family appreciation dinner, the invitation that had arrived through Simone like a summons rather than a request. She'd mentioned it 3 days ago, barely looking at him as she spoke. "Mama's having a dinner on Thursday. Try to wear something decent for once." Try to wear something decent. As if decency had ever been his problem. As if he was the one who had failed to uphold the basic dignities of marriage and family. "Thursday works," Darnell said slowly, the words taking shape as a plan formed in his mind. Winston was quiet for a moment. They had known each other long enough to communicate in silences, and this silence was heavy with understanding. "You sure about this?" Winston asked finally. "Having that call during the dinner?" Darnell looked around his workshop, at the blueprints on the walls, marked with his handwriting, stained with his coffee, born from his mind, at the prototype on the table, evidence of problems he'd solved that other engineers hadn't even identified, at the folder in his desk drawer, the one that held every receipt for every dollar he'd invested, every late night he'd worked, every sacrifice he'd made to bring this dream to life. "I've been quiet for 11 years, Winston. Took everything they gave me and never said a word. Never defended myself. Never corrected them. Never let them see how much it hurt." "I know," Winston said softly. "I watched. So let the timing speak for me. Let them hear it. Not because I need revenge, but because—" Darnell paused, searching for the right words. "Because I need them to know. Just once. I need them to see who I actually am." Winston understood. He didn't try to talk Darnell out of it or offer alternatives. He just said, "Then Thursday it is, brother. I'll make sure Adeyemi's team knows to call at 7 sharp. Thank you, Winston, for everything, for keeping this secret, for believing in me when nobody else did." "That's what brothers do," Winston said. "Now go home and get some rest. You've got a long week ahead of you." Darnell hung up and sat in the silence of his workshop for a long time. The weight of what was coming settled over him slowly, not like a burden, but like armor. For 7 years, he had built something in the shadows, not out of shame, but out of survival. Because some dreams are too fragile to share with people who only know how to crush them. Simone had stopped asking about his dreams a long time ago. She'd stopped asking about his work, his hopes, his fears, his anything. She asked about bills and repairs, and why he couldn't be more like Terrence. That was the extent of her curiosity about the man she'd married. So he'd stopped offering. He'd built his castle in secret, brick by brick, and now it was almost time to reveal what silence had been protecting all along. The night before the dinner, Darnell sat alone in his workshop long after the city had gone dark. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a pale, sterile glow that felt appropriate for what he was about to do. He opened a drawer he rarely touched, the bottom drawer of an old filing cabinet he'd bought secondhand when he first rented this space, and pulled out a folder that held more than paper. It held proof. Not of his success, that was coming, but proof of his endurance, of his dignity, of the man he had chosen to remain even when everyone around him tried to make him someone smaller. Inside the folder were birthday cards from Simone, the ones she'd stopped giving after year 3 of their marriage. The first few were sweet, filled with handwritten notes about how lucky she was to have found him. The last one was generic, store-bought sentiment, with just her name signed at the bottom. After that, nothing. As if his birthdays had stopped mattering. There was a handwritten note from Lorraine that he'd found tucked inside a book she'd gifted him years ago, a self-help tome about men who maximized their potential. The note said, "Simone could have done so much better. I pray every day that she realizes this before it's too late." Lorraine hadn't known Darnell would find it, hadn't meant for him to see those words, but he'd seen them, and he'd kept them, not as ammunition, but as evidence. Evidence that he wasn't imagining the contempt, that it was real, documented, undeniable. There were his wedding vows, written in his own hand on the hotel stationery the night before he married Simone. He'd promised to love her, honor her, cherish her in good times and bad. He'd promised to be her partner, her confidant, her shelter from the storms of life. He'd kept every single one of those promises, every single one. She'd kept none. Darnell didn't store these things to use as weapons. He kept them as proof. Proof that he had tried, that he had stayed, that he had never stopped being the man he promised to be, even when the woman he'd made those promises to forgot her own. The next morning, Darnell met Winston for breakfast at a quiet diner on the far side of town, away from anyone who might recognize them. They sat in a corner booth with cracked vinyl seats and a window that looked out on an empty parking lot. The coffee was mediocre, but neither of them was there for the coffee. "How you feeling?" Winston asked, studying his friend's face for signs of doubt or weakness. Darnell stirred his cup slowly, watching the cream spiral into the dark liquid. "I've been ready for 11 years. I just didn't know what I was waiting for." "And you're sure this is how you want to do it? The call during dinner?" "I'm sure." Darnell looked up, meeting Winston's eyes. "This isn't about revenge. You know that, right?" "I know. But they won't see it that way. Simone, Lorraine, they're going to think you planned this to humiliate them. Maybe. But that's not why I'm doing it." Darnell paused, gathering his thoughts. "I just want to be seen, Winston. One time, in front of the people who spent 11 years looking through me like I wasn't there. I want them to see who I actually am, what I actually built. And then I want to walk away." Winston nodded slowly. He'd watched Darnell carry more weight than any man should have to carry alone. Had watched him swallow insults that would have broken lesser men. Had watched him keep building, keep working, keep believing, even when no one else did. "You deserve this," Winston said quietly. "Whatever happens tonight, you deserve to be seen." "I know. Took me a long time to believe that. But I know it now." They finished their breakfast in companionable silence, two men who had known each other long enough to not need words for everything. When they parted in the parking lot, Winston pulled Darnell into a hug, something they rarely did, being the kind of men who expressed affection through presence rather than gesture. "Call me after," Winston said, "no matter how late." "I will." Darnell drove home with the windows down, letting the morning air wash over him. The day stretched ahead, hours of waiting before the evening that would change everything. He thought about his mother, the way he always did when something significant was about to happen. Claudette had been a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep Darnell fed, clothed, and believing in himself. She cleaned offices downtown from 6 to 10 in the morning. She worked the register at a grocery store from 11 to 5. She did alterations and mending in the evenings for neighbors who paid her in cash and gratitude. She slept maybe 5 hours a night and never once complained about being tired. She died 5 years ago, before Darnell filed his first patent, before Solomon Adeyemi's team discovered his work, before any of this became real. She never saw her son's name on a legal document that would change an industry. Never saw him shake hands with a billionaire. Never saw him finally stand tall after years of being made to feel small. But everything Darnell had become, everything he had built, it all traced back to her. To the nights she stayed up helping him with homework, even when her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. To the words she repeated so often they became the architecture of his soul. A man's value isn't in what people say about him. It's in what he does when no one's watching. She never saw any of this, but her fingerprints were on every blueprint he ever drew. And tonight, when the truth finally spoke, it would speak in a voice she had taught him to use. Simone came home at 5 o'clock, already stressed about the dinner. She moved through the house in a whirlwind of irritation and anxiety, gathering her things, checking her makeup in every mirror she passed, holding earrings up to her ears and discarding them for other options. She barely acknowledged Darnell's presence. "Don't embarrass me tonight," she said, as she fastened a gold necklace around her throat. She didn't look at him as she spoke, didn't ask how his day had been or what he was thinking or feeling, just issued her command and expected compliance. Darnell watched her from the doorway of their bedroom. 11 years, he thought. 11 years of being treated like an inconvenience in his own home. "I'll be ready," he said quietly. She glanced at him then, a quick appraisal that found him wanting, as always. "Wear the blue shirt. It's the only one that fits you properly." He didn't respond, just nodded and went to change. As he dressed, the blue shirt, as instructed, paired with slacks he'd ironed himself that morning, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen and felt something shift in his chest. The message was from Solomon Adeyemi. "Looking forward to speaking this evening, Mr. Darnell. History awaits." History awaits. Darnell read the words twice, letting them sink into his bones. Then he pocketed his phone, straightened his collar, and went downstairs to join his wife for the last family dinner he would ever attend as the man they thought he was. Lorraine's house was exactly what Darnell had expected. Large, immaculate, and designed to impress. It sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in a neighborhood where the lawns were professionally maintained, and the cars in the driveways cost more than Darnell's annual salary. The driveway alone could have housed 4 vehicles comfortably, and tonight it held Terrence's Mercedes, Lorraine's Lexus, and now Darnell's Camry, which looked like a poor relation come to beg at the rich family's door. Inside, the walls were covered with photographs. Nia and Terrence on vacation in Paris. Nia and Terrence at some charity gala, dressed in formal wear, smiling for cameras. The whole family at Christmas, gathered around a tree that looked like it belonged in a department store window. Photo after photo of success and happiness, and proof of a life well lived. There was not a single picture of Darnell anywhere. Terrence greeted them at the door with a handshake that lasted too long, and a comment that arrived right on schedule. "Darnell, still driving that Camry, I see. What is that, a 2015? Classic reliability, I guess. Some people prefer dependability over style." He laughed as if he'd told a joke. Simone laughed too, the way she always did when Terrence made his little digs. Darnell just smiled politely. "It gets me where I need to go," he said. Terrence clapped him on the shoulder with the kind of casual condescension that wealthy people deploy without even realizing they're doing it. "That's the spirit, my man. That's the spirit." The dining room table was set like a stage. Fine china, crystal glasses, cloth napkins folded into elaborate shapes. Lorraine had spared no expense, though Darnell suspected the expense was less about hospitality and more about performance. This was her domain, her kingdom, and everything in it was designed to remind visitors of her success and taste and superiority. Lorraine sat at the head of the table like a queen on her throne. Nia and Terence flanked her on one side, their positions marking them as favored subjects. Simone took her seat beside her sister, leaving Darnell at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen, furthest from importance. The meal began with small talk that wasn't small at all. Every sentence was a measurement. Every compliment to Terence was an implied comparison to Darnell. Lorraine spoke at length about the remodel Terence had just completed on their vacation home in Hilton Head. Nia mentioned their upcoming anniversary trip to Dubai, first class, of course, and a suite at the Burj Al Arab. Simone listened with hungry eyes, her gaze darting between her sister's designer dress and her own, between Terence's confident posture and Darnell's quiet stillness. She glanced at Darnell with something between shame and blame, as if his presence alone was responsible for the gap between her life and her sister's. "So, Darnell," Lorraine said, setting down her wine glass with the careful precision of someone who had been waiting for this moment all evening. "How's that little engineering job treating you these days?" Darnell met her gaze without flinching. "It's steady, Ms. Lorraine. Thank you for asking." "Steady." Terence chuckled, swirling his wine. "That's one word for it. Personally, I couldn't do steady. I need growth, challenges, something to keep the mind sharp." He tapped his temple. "No offense, Darnell. Different strokes for different folks." "None taken," Darnell said. Lorraine smiled, but it was the kind of smile that cut rather than welcomed. "Well, we can't all be captains of industry. Someone has to do the supporting work." They laughed. All of them. Even Simone, though she tried to disguise it as a cough. 11 years of laughter at his expense, and they didn't even have the decency to pretend anymore. Darnell kept eating, kept breathing, kept waiting. The phone in his pocket felt heavy, charged with potential energy about to be released. Lorraine raised her glass. "I want to make a toast," she announced, and the table fell silent in deference. "To family. To my beautiful daughters, who make me prouder every single day. To Terence, who has given Nia everything a woman could ever want. Success, security, the life she deserves." She paused, letting the silence do its work. Then she turned her gaze to Darnell. "And to Darnell, we appreciate you trying. Really, we do. Simone, maybe one day he'll give you the life you deserve. We have to have faith." The table laughed. Nia covered her mouth politely. Terence raised his glass with a smirk. Simone didn't defend her husband. She never did. "Hey, nothing wrong with being a worker bee," Terence added, leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who had never been humbled. "Not everyone can be a boss. The world needs people who show up and do the grunt work. Where would we be without them?" Darnell set his fork down slowly. He didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't explain. He just breathed, feeling the weight of 11 years pressing against his chest. And then, like a wave receding before a tsunami, releasing. His phone buzzed against his thigh. Then it rang. Everyone turned to look at him. Phones ringing during Lorraine's dinners were considered a breach of protocol, an insult to the hostess. But Darnell didn't apologize. He reached into his pocket and looked at the screen. "Solomon Adeyemi, Adeyemi Infrastructure Holdings." Simone frowned, irritation and confusion warring on her face. "Who is that?" "Darnell. We're in the middle of dinner." Darnell stood, calm as still water. "Excuse me. I need to take this." He answered the phone with the composure of a man who had been waiting for this moment his entire life. "Mr. Adeyemi?" "Yes, sir. I'm available to speak." The room watched. Lorraine's frown deepened into something approaching alarm. Terrence leaned forward, his curiosity overcoming his contempt. Naya stopped chewing. Simone's lips parted, but no words came. Darnell listened, nodding slowly as Solomon's deep, cultured voice filled his ear with the words he'd been waiting 7 years to hear. The final confirmation. The official offer. The beginning of everything new. Then he spoke the words that rewrote 11 years in a single sentence. I understand. The $22 million offer is acceptable. I'll have my attorney finalize the terms tomorrow. Silence. Complete. Absolute. The kind of silence that falls after an explosion, before the dust settles, and people begin to understand what has changed. Darnell thanked Mr. Adeyemi for his time, confirmed that he would be available for the formal closing next week, and ended the call with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout. Then he returned to his seat as if nothing had happened. He picked up his fork, took a bite of the roast that Lorraine had prepared. Simone's voice cracked like thin ice. Darnell, what was that? Lorraine leaned forward, her composure finally fractured. Who is Solomon Adeyemi? Terrence was already on his phone, Googling with fingers that had suddenly lost their steadiness. His face went pale. He's a billionaire. Infrastructure development. He's worth over $4 billion. The table absorbed this information in stages. Nia's hand went to her chest. Lorraine's mouth opened and closed without sound. Simone looked at Darnell as if seeing him for the first time, or perhaps as if realizing she had never seen him at all. Darnell took a sip of water before speaking. Mr. Adeyemi is acquiring 2 patents I developed over the last 7 years, structural load distribution technology for sustainable construction. The deal closes next month. Simone shook her head, trying to make the words compute. Patents? What patents? Why didn't you tell me? Darnell looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he hadn't allowed himself to look in years. You never asked. 3 words. 11 years of silence, condensed into 3 words. And in those words, everything that had been hidden was finally, irrevocably revealed. The table erupted into chaos after that. Lorraine tried to recover, her voice suddenly warm and welcoming in a way it had never been before. Well, this is wonderful news. Darnell, why didn't you share this with family? We would have supported you. Darnell wiped his mouth with his napkin, taking his time. With respect, Ms. Lorraine, I learned a long time ago what this family thinks of me. Every dinner, every holiday, every comment about my little job and my steady life. I didn't need that energy anywhere near my work. Terrence, still reeling, tried to pivot into ally mode. Hey man, if you need investment advice, I know some people who could really help you manage that kind of money. $22 million is serious capital. I have people, Darnell said. Thank you. Simone reached for his arm, desperation bleeding through her carefully maintained composure. Darnell, we need to talk. Privately. Please. He looked at her hand on his sleeve, the same hand that hadn't touched him with affection in years, the same hand that gestured dismissively when he tried to share his thoughts, the same hand that had never once reached across the bed to find him in the dark. We've had 11 years to talk, Simone. You chose silence. So did I. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse. He simply told the truth. And the truth did what it always does when it's been held too long. It broke everything it touched. The ride home was silent except for Simone's quiet crying in the passenger seat. Darnell drove with both hands on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. There was nothing to say. Everything that needed saying had been said at that dinner table, witnessed by the people who had spent 11 years making him feel small. At home, Simone tried again, tried to rewrite history, while the ink was still wet on the story they'd actually lived. I always believed in you, Darnell. You have to know that. I didn't know how to show it. My mother, she has these expectations, and I got caught up in trying to meet them. But I always knew you were special." Darnell stood in the hallway, his keys still in his hand. He let her words wash over him without letting them in. "You showed it every day," he said quietly. "Every comment, every comparison. Every time you laughed when they called me less than. Every time you stayed silent when you could have spoken up. Every time you looked at me like I was the reason you couldn't have the life you wanted." "I was wrong," she sobbed. "I know I was wrong. Can't we try? Can't we start over?" Darnell considered the question. He thought about his mother, about the vows he'd made, about the man he'd tried to be for 11 years in a marriage that had never valued him. "I forgive you, Simone. I do. Carrying anger isn't something I want to do." He paused. "But I can't rebuild something that was never built on truth. We never had a foundation, and I can't keep pretending we did." He walked past her, toward the guest room he would sleep in that night, and every night after. She didn't follow. Perhaps she finally understood that some doors, once closed, don't open again. The following weeks moved with the precision of a well-engineered structure. Winston filed the separation papers. Simone contested the divorce. She wanted half of the $22 million, claiming that as his wife, she was entitled to everything he'd built during their marriage. But Darnell had been careful, meticulous. 7 years of documentation, every receipt, every investment, every hour logged at the workshop. The patents were filed under his mother's maiden name, funded entirely by pre-marital savings and income Simone had never touched or contributed to. The court reviewed the evidence, boxes of it, organized and annotated, and ruled in Darnell's favor. The patents and their proceeds were his sole property, built without any marital contribution. Simone walked out of that courthouse with nothing but the realization that she had spent 11 years married to a man she never knew, because she never bothered to look. Lorraine called Darnell the day after the ruling, her voice transformed into something he'd never heard from her before, something almost resembling respect. "Darnell, your family. Let's not let one dinner ruin everything we've built together over the years." He listened to her the way he'd listened to her for 11 years, but this time he responded differently. "That dinner didn't ruin anything, Ms. Lorraine. It just revealed what was already there." He hung up before she could reply. He'd given that family 11 years of his patience. He had no more to spare. The deal with Solomon Adeyemi closed on a Tuesday morning in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the Atlanta skyline. Darnell wore a suit he'd bought with his own money. Not flashy, not excessive, just right. It fit him well because he'd had it tailored, a small indulgence that felt less like luxury and more like respect. Respect for the moment. Respect for himself. Solomon Adeyemi was there in person, a tall man with silver hair, a firm handshake, and eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize substance when they encountered it. He had built his empire from nothing, a Nigerian immigrant who arrived in America with $200 and a degree in civil engineering, who faced every obstacle the world could throw at him and turned each one into a stepping stone. "I've watched a lot of men with your talent get crushed," Solomon said as they sat across from each other, the final document spread between them. Crushed by circumstances, crushed by people who didn't understand them, crushed by their own inability to protect what mattered. He paused, studying Darnell with something like admiration. "You protected your work, built it in silence, filed it under your mother's name so no one could interfere. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." Darnell nodded slowly. "I had a mother who taught me that my value wasn't up for debate. She didn't raise me to seek permission. She raised me to build." Solomon smiled, a rare thing, from what Darnell had heard. Then she raised a king. The offer that came next was more than money. Solomon wanted Darnell to join Adeyemi Infrastructure Holdings as Chief Innovation Consultant. Equity stake, global projects. A seat at tables Darnell had never even known existed, making decisions that would shape how cities were built for generations to come. He accepted, not because he needed validation. He'd learned to live without that long ago. But because this was the work he was meant to do, and now, finally, he could do it in the light instead of the shadows. Life has a way of balancing scales that seem permanently tipped. 6 months after Darnell's deal closed, Terrence's firm was investigated for securities violations. He wasn't charged. The lawyers he could afford made sure of that. But his reputation took damage that money couldn't repair. Clients fled. Partners distanced themselves. The golden son-in-law that Lorraine had held up as the standard against which all men should be measured suddenly didn't shine so bright. Naya separated from him quietly, moving back in with Lorraine while she figured out what came next. The family that had spent 11 years looking down on Darnell suddenly had their own fall to contend with. Darnell took no pleasure in any of it. Revenge had never been his goal. But he noted the irony. Some falls aren't punishments. They're just gravity, finally catching up. Simone reached out one final time, months after the divorce was finalized. Not for money. That ship had sailed. But for something else. Closure, maybe. Understanding. They met at a coffee shop neither of them had been to before. Neutral territory for a conversation that couldn't happen anywhere, that held memories. "I've been thinking a lot," Simone said, her hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't really drinking. "About us. About what went wrong. About what I did." Darnell listened. That was something he'd always been good at. "I think I spent so long being afraid we'd fail," she continued, "that I made sure you felt like you already had. Like you weren't enough. Like nothing you did would ever be enough." She looked up at him, her eyes red but dry. "That was me, Darnell. My fear. My insecurity. I put that on you, and you carried it for 11 years without complaining." "I know," he said simply. "How did you do it? How did you keep going, keep building, when I was tearing you down every day?" Darnell thought about the question, thought about his mother, thought about the workshop and the early mornings and the silent nights when he kept working while the world slept. "Because what you thought of me was never the truth," he said finally. "It was just noise. The truth was in the work. The truth was in what I built when no one was watching." Simone nodded, absorbing this. "I'm sorry, Darnell. I know that doesn't fix anything. But I need you to know that I'm sorry." "I know you are," he paused. "And I forgive you. But forgiveness isn't reunion, Simone. It's just the door you walk through on your way to somewhere else." They parted that day not as enemies, but as strangers who had once shared a lie and finally told each other the truth. It was the most honest conversation they'd had in 11 years, and it was their last. A year after the acquisition closed, Darnell stood on a construction site in Accra, Ghana, watching workers break ground on a sustainable housing project that would shelter 3,000 families. His designs, his technology, his mother's legacy, made physical in steel and concrete and hope. The Claudette Foundation had launched 6 months earlier. Scholarships for young black engineers from single-parent homes, the kind of kids Darnell had been, the kind who had talent, but not opportunity. At the launch event, held in a ballroom in Atlanta, he'd spoken publicly for the first time about his journey. "My mother worked 3 jobs so I could have books," he told the audience. "She never saw my name on a patent, never saw any of this. But everything I am, everything I've built, it belongs to her. This foundation is her legacy, not mine. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Reporters asked him sometimes about his ex-wife, about the family dinner that had become legendary in certain circles, about how it felt to have the last laugh. He never gave them what they wanted. No bitterness, no satisfaction, no evidence that he was still wounded by the past. "I had seasons that taught me patience," he would say, "and I'm grateful for them." That was all. That was enough, because Darnell understood something most people never learn. Revenge would have been easy. Anyone can burn a bridge. Anyone can make the people who hurt them feel the same pain. But that's not strength. That's just damage passed on, poison recycled, pain perpetuated. Real strength is building something beautiful out of the silence they tried to bury you in. Real strength is becoming so complete that their opinions no longer register. Real strength is waking up one morning and realizing that the people who called you a failure don't even have the power to enter your thoughts anymore. On the last evening of his trip to Ghana, Darnell sat on a balcony overlooking Accra as the sun melted into the horizon. The city hummed beneath him, alive with possibility. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt genuinely at peace. He held his mother's photograph, the same one from his workshop, now framed and carried with him wherever he went. Her smile looked out at him, unchanged by time, full of the love that had shaped him into who he was. "We made it, Mama," he whispered. The breeze carried his words out over the city, over the ocean, over the years of silence and sacrifice and patience that had led him here. Some men fight for recognition. Darnell never did. He let his work speak. Let his loyalty speak. Let his silence carry the weight until the world was finally ready to listen. And when they finally heard him, he was already whole. Darnell stayed silent for 11 years. Some might call that weakness. Others might call it wisdom. What do you think? When is silence strength, and when does it become sacrifice? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story reminded you of someone who deserves to be seen, share it with them. Subscribe for more stories about patience, principle, and the quiet power of people who refuse to be defined by those who underestimate them.